Thank you very much. It's great to be here. And I'm going to try not to cough my way through this presentation. But if I do, I hope you please forgive me. As you heard, I want to talk about culture and entrepreneurship. And in the context of this conference's theme, G&H of business, I want to suggest that the role of culture in how we understand the concept of entrepreneurship itself is critical for how we then promote sustainable business or G&H in business. And I'll suggest that we need to rethink entrepreneurship through the lens of culture to effectively foster sustainable entrepreneurship, foster G&H in Bhutan and elsewhere. And I want to do this by looking at and comparing Indonesia and Bhutan through some research that looked at how Indonesian and Bhutanese entrepreneurs themselves understand entrepreneurship based on their own cultural values, their own cultural lens. And then look at the implications for sustainable entrepreneurship generally and G&H in business in Bhutan. Now, entrepreneurship is generally understood as the creation of new businesses that provide self-employment, focused on economic growth, and usually create jobs. So it's viewed as a key strategy for economic growth. It enhances competition, it catalyzes innovation, boosts employment, creates new products and services. So it's a key strategy for economic growth. Yet, perhaps not surprisingly, the level of entrepreneurial activity or entrepreneurial motivation is different across different countries. Some countries are more entrepreneurial than others. And if you look at entrepreneurship research, it identifies a whole range of variables that try to explain why these differences in entrepreneurship activity and entrepreneurship motivation occur across different countries. And one variable that is focused on quite frequently is a country's culture, or what is called national culture. And the argument in this research is that cultural values in a country influence either positively or negatively or possibly neutrally the degree of entrepreneurship activity and the degree of entrepreneurial motivation within a country. So different cultural characteristics will influence the level of entrepreneurship differently in different countries. So what kinds of cultural characteristics then promote entrepreneurship? Well, perhaps the most well-known and the most influential way to understand and analyze culture is through a set of dimensions of culture provided by a researcher named Hofstede. And Hofstede provides 6 dimensions. I'm not sure if you can read that. There's a lot of text there. But 6 dimensions of a national culture. And these include the following. Number 1 is called power distance. This is the degree to which a society accepts a hierarchical or unequal order. The second dimension is individualism versus collectivism. Okay, and that's a preference on the one hand for individuals who look after themselves versus a tight-knit collectivity that takes care of one another. The third dimension is masculinity versus femininity. A little bit unfortunate phrasing there, but what this looks at is a preference for achievement, competition, and quantity, that's the masculine component, versus cooperation, caring, and quality. The fourth dimension is uncertainty avoidance. That's the extent a society is comfortable with ambiguity or uncertainty. Fifth is long-term versus short-term orientation. That's a preference on the one hand for maintaining traditions, maintaining the past, versus focusing on the future and how you balance those two. And then the last of these 6 dimensions is indulgence versus restraint. That's the preference in a society for gratification of desires versus the suppression of those desires. And the idea is that each national culture is characterized by where they fit on these 6 dimensions. And overall, this provides a characterization of a country's national culture. Now, how is this related to entrepreneurship? How are these dimensions of culture related to greater entrepreneurial activity and greater entrepreneurial motivation in a country? Well, just to be clear, there are some disagreements in the academic research on this. But generally speaking, what's generally thought is that entrepreneurship is promoted by a national culture with these 4 of the 6 dimensions. So first of all, low power distance. So a culture that values equality over hierarchy. That promotes entrepreneurship. Number two, high individualism, a focus on the individual rather than the community. High masculinity, that's a focus on competition over cooperation, and low uncertainty avoidance. And that's this notion that you're comfortable with ambiguity as an entrepreneur. And again, just to reemphasize, there's some disagreement in the literature over these, but this is generally, these 4 of the 6 are generally seen as promoting entrepreneurship. So what are the implications of this then for individual countries? I've chosen to look at 2, Indonesia and Bhutan. Initially I was just going to do Bhutan, but I thought it might be interesting to have some comparison with another country. And the data are from 2 separate studies, one on each country, involving qualitative, semi-structured interviews with about 81 entrepreneurs from both countries. And then I'll also draw on some research from other researchers as well. And I've referred to these 2 cases as snapshots because they're meant to be, they're qualitative, they're meant to be sort of exploratory and a starting point. So let's start with Indonesia. If we apply those 6 dimensions of Hofstede to Indonesia, this is what research has tended to find. Okay, you'll see there, power distance in Indonesia is high. And remember, low power distance is what promotes entrepreneurship. Individualism is very low. Okay, Indonesia is a collectivist society. And again, remember, entrepreneurship is promoted by high individualism. Masculinity, this notion of competition, is medium. And again, the literature suggests high masculinity promotes entrepreneurship. And uncertainty avoidance is medium here. And the literature suggests low uncertainty avoidance promotes entrepreneurship. So when we look at this, Indonesia's national culture appears on the surface to be a challenge to promoting effective entrepreneurship as an economic growth strategy. And the reality on the ground kind of bears this out. There's a lot of micro-enterprises in Indonesia. They are a large source of employment, but their contributions to economic growth are underwhelming. And within quite a bit of research, Indonesia's national culture is pointed to as one of the culprits for this. Okay, it doesn't have a culture of entrepreneurship. And you can find this in a range of research. Here's just one citation from one particular study. It says, cultural values in Indonesia are inhibitors, as high power distance, uncertainty avoidance, and collectivism all hinder entrepreneurship. Now, while it may be true that Indonesian cultural values inhibit an economically deterministic understanding of entrepreneurship, a different picture emerges if we look at entrepreneurship through the lens of Indonesian culture itself. Because the Indonesian respondents, they conceptualized entrepreneurship in terms that are much broader than economic growth. They conceptualized entrepreneurship based on their collectivist cultural values. For them, entrepreneurship is as much about promoting collective social good as it is about economic growth. All right, so you have the 2, collective social good here, economic growth here. They're parallel and largely equal entrepreneurial concerns. And this came up over and over and over in these interviews. And here's just a couple of quotations from two entrepreneurs in Indonesia. And I should state that this is no mere focus on corporate social responsibility. This is not social entrepreneurship. Enhancing collective social good it's foundational. It's inherent to how they understand the concept of entrepreneurship itself, in parallel with economic growth. So these respondents, these Indonesian entrepreneurs, they're not choosing to be social entrepreneurs or socially responsible. It's basically their default understanding of what entrepreneurship is. Okay, and they put this conceptualization of entrepreneurship into practice through the kinds of businesses they start and the kinds of people that they hire. Now, this, of course, is not to say that profit is not a motivation. Of course, it's a big motivation for them. It's also not to suggest that Indonesian entrepreneurs are somehow more compassionate than the rest of us. All this suggests is that their cultural values direct them away from a solely economically focused understanding of entrepreneurship. And it drives them towards social and economic dimensions as equally consequential in business. And this reconceptualization of entrepreneurship through an Indonesian cultural lens means that Indonesian culture is not an inhibitor of entrepreneurship. In fact, it's probably a facilitator of fostering a culturally relevant notion of entrepreneurship that is more closely recognizable as sustainable entrepreneurship. It's bridging social and economic concerns. So rethinking entrepreneurship through an Indonesian cultural lens gives us a different entry point. in how sustainable entrepreneurship can be promoted, the enabling environment that can be created in Indonesia. So let's switch over to Bhutan. Now, the private sector in Bhutan, as we probably all know, has historically been quite small. And given this history, there's been, I think, significant government effort to promote private sector development and entrepreneurship. So just two examples. You have the 2010 Economic Development Policy that strives to promote a private sector enabling environment. You have the 2012 Cottage Small Medium Industry Policy that has 6 areas of focus, and one of them is to develop a culture of entrepreneurship in Bhutan. So how does Bhutan's national culture then fit into that? Well, let's look at Hofstede's dimensions of culture for Bhutan. The blue is Bhutan, and for comparison, the orange is Indonesia. So as you can see here, power distance in Bhutan is very high. And again, remember, low power distance is what promotes entrepreneurship, according to the research. Individualism is medium, and again, high individualism promotes entrepreneurship. Masculinity is low, relatively low. High masculinity promotes entrepreneurship. And uncertainty avoidance in Bhutan is low. And now that's good news, because low uncertainty avoidance is what the literature suggests promotes entrepreneurship. And the data for those other two are not available, and they're less important to this in any ways. So if we look at that, like Indonesia, aspects of Bhutan's natural culture overall would appear to represent a potential break on promoting entrepreneurship as an economic growth strategy. And indeed, some research bears this out. There's not a whole lot of research on this, but there are a number of studies. Here's a sample of one. This is from a Canadian colleague of mine. And it says the development of effective national entrepreneurship programs in Bhutan will face significant challenges from adverse cultural factors. Okay, notice the phrase there, adverse cultural factors. Now, I'm not disputing this, but a more positive picture emerges again for the role of cultural values if the concept of entrepreneurship itself is reframed through a Bhutanese cultural lens. And again, if we look at how Bhutanese entrepreneurs, how the respondents themselves conceptualized entrepreneurship and business, based on their cultural values, it moves beyond an economic-centric focus. So whereas Indonesians defined it in terms of collective social good in parallel with economic growth, the Bhutanese business people that were interviewed, they redefined entrepreneurship in terms of interdependence, and particularly in terms of economic, cultural, and ecological interdependence. Now that sounds kind of familiar, right? Whether you're talking about the original 4 pillars of the 9 domains, they're drawing on GNH here. Economic, cultural, and ecological interdependence. And again, they talked about how this was rooted in their cultural values, and they talked about things like harmony, balance, interconnectedness, right? And those are GNH values. The interesting thing is, very few of these entrepreneurs connected that to GNH. Many of them did not understand GNH or misunderstood GNH. In some cases, they even claimed to be opposed to GNH. But these values that they're talking about when they conceptualize entrepreneurship, for the most part, are GNH values. They're Bhutanese cultural values. So for them, there's a tight and inherent interdependence and interconnectedness that weaves through economic, cultural, and environmental concerns. And entrepreneurship is about interdependence across all of these. So it's not like we in the West, where we sort of see these as sort of freestanding things that are engaged in sort of a zero-sum game, but they're interconnected and holistically seen as working together. Here's a quote from, again, this came up over and over. Here's a quote from one Bhutanese respondent. "Profit is not everything. Our philosophy and belief is we are profitable as a society, as a community, as a tour company. We need to take care of cultural and ecological things. If not, we'll kill the golden goose." So let me just finish up here. So moving to this more interdependent conceptualization of entrepreneurship, again, repositions Bhutan's role or Bhutan's culture from one of a break on entrepreneurship as something that's an economic phenomenon to a potential facilitator of entrepreneurship that is more sustainable and more consistent with GNH. So let me just conclude. An emerging picture arises from these 2 snapshots from Indonesia and Bhutan. While national cultures in both countries may inhibit entrepreneurship when defined purely in terms of economics, these same cultures, in contrast, likely contribute positively to promoting a more sustainable notion of entrepreneurship, or GNH notion of entrepreneurship. culture becomes a springboard on which to build sustainable private sector, or in Bhutan, a G&H private sector. So lastly, what are the practical applications of this? Well, I'll just say very, very generally here, and I think we've heard this already in this morning session. Policy and programs in Bhutan intended to promote G&H in the private sector, whether that's government policy and programs or private sector programs themselves, they need to be explicitly rooted in Bhutanese cultural values and explicitly rooted in a Bhutanese conceptualization of what entrepreneurship is. Cultural values will then direct attention to what is most valuable in the sustainability equation and what is less emphasized. Policies and programs can then consolidate strengths and they can address weaknesses. So, whether that's developing education and training programs, whether it's improving access to capital, whether it's designing tools to measure business activity, as we heard earlier, a one-size-fits-all cultural approach to entrepreneurship policies and entrepreneurship programs won't work. Policies and programs should put national cultural values at the heart as a way to promote a culturally relevant notion of sustainable entrepreneurship, or in Bhutan, foster G&H in business. Thank you.